Hallo meine Schüler, heute werden wir decken Kapitel 4, das Reich im Umbruch. Können beginnen. At first, we're going to see that the English followed a policy of what is known as salutary neglect. This happened in like the mid-18th century, since the Glorious Revolution through the mid-18th century, where the colonists liked the British because the British pretty much let them do as they please. They let them have pretty much any freedoms they want. But starting in like the 1760s through the 1770s, we start to see changes in international and domestic affairs that led the British to exert more control over the colonists, which kind of made them a little bit upset. So what was happening why was there this salutary neglect? There are several reasons. Number one, the Parliament was extremely powerful this time in England. Parliament is their version of Congress that we have today. They didn't really care about us that much. They didn't want to have a lot of power over the colonies. They were more worried about themselves and just trading with us. When it came to the Colonial Administration, basically like the governors of each colony, they didn't really care. They were pretty corrupt. They just wanted money and just to relax, and they just gave all their power to the legislatures. So the legislatures were the ones in the colonies that were really ruling, the ones that were imposing taxes, and they felt like they were sovereign. They felt like they had the power to rule their area.
Join us or die.
Come 1754, we were going to start the French and Indian War, but we weren't united at all. Felt like each colony was their own state. They could do their own thing. And Ben Franklin realized we needed to unite against this common foe, which were the French and the Indians. So he created the Albany Plan of Union and said, hey, colonies, let's all join together. If we don't, we're going to fall apart. We're going to die. These guys are going to kill us. And about 12 people from 5 of the 13 colonies showed up. So obviously it was a big bust. In the mid-18th century, we were seeing France and Britain fighting a lot with each other over just commercial and international and national supremacy. So we're seeing a lot of wars between the two of them. We see King William's War that was at the end of the 17th century, and then in the 18th century, Queen Anne's War and King George's War was between the French and the British. They just constantly were fighting each other over supremacy of trade, over supremacy of naval power, and it just got worse and worse. They constantly were fighting, and their relationship constantly was deteriorating. Why in the world do we care about the French and the English fighting each other? You have to remember that the English were the ones that controlled us, and the French controlled a lot of area of what is present-day America, and they named it New France. And there were major conflicts, and the area that they were fighting over the most was the Ohio Valley. Now, the French, remember, had good relationship with the Indians, except the Iroquois, who were the biggest nation out of all the Indian nations. Their confederacy, after King George's War, started to make trade concessions with the English, which really ticked off the French. So the French kind of freaked out and were a little nervous that the English were going to come trotting on their land in the Ohio Valley, so they started building forts in this area. In response to the French making their own military forts, the English started building their own too. So they built Fort Necessity, also known as Fort Duquesne, at where we see near present-day Pittsburgh. George Washington was sent there to fight off the French, and they did, and they failed abysmally. They just got absolutely destroyed. But this was the beginning of the French and Indian War. At first, the French were really winning the war. Remember, it's the French and most Indian tribes versus the English and the Iroquois. General Edward Braddock just got annihilated by the French, and then because they really didn't have much help. And so after that, Secretary of State William Pitt took over. He takes charge. He does several things like forced enlistment, impressment, and then confiscating goods from colonists without compensation. So of course the colonists were getting pretty upset about that. But they were able to win. They had the turning point of the war was when the British sieged Quebec. And then eventually the British ended the war with the French with the Treaty of Paris, and the French decided to give all land in North America east of the Mississippi except for New Orleans to the British. So the British did win the French and Indian War. So what were the effects of the 7 years or the French and Indian War? We see that the colonists know that they can now unite against a common foe. Eventually that's going to be Britain. In this case, it was the French and the Indians. They resisted British interference with local affairs. They're starting to see the British take a tighter rein on them, and they really don't want it, and they resist that. The American militia who fought with the English began to see really a lot of differences between them and the English, so they're starting to want to pull away from them. And the Indians received British enmity, which means like they received nothing from the British, so that hurts the Iroquois and their confederacy begins to unravel. If you look at this map, this shows part of the 7 Years' War, and this part was the French and Indian War part of it. But the 7 Years' War was a war all over the world. It was a world war, and you could see it was in places from the Caribbean to Africa to even the Philippines and Asia. So it was all over the place, but our part of the 7 Years' War was known as the French and Indian War. We're now seeing the British become more imperialist rather than just traders, and they've pretty much gotten rid of the idea of salutary neglect with the colonists because they were broke. They had a huge war. They had the 7 Years' War. They're fighting all over the world and with us in the colonies, so now they needed a way to make money. So instead of looking at us as a commercial venture, they were now turning into territorial imperialists where they wanted more control over our affairs. They ended salutary neglect, like I said, and they really want to impose more taxes on us because they were having such staggering war debts. So they figured, we fought for them, we fought for them to have safety, might as well make them pay for it. And the English actually were pretty happy with it because they felt like they shouldn't be paying for us for the debt that we caused with that war. King George III, though, he's the king of the time, and he's not a really good leader, like I've taught you before. He's kind of a Looney Tune. He is immature, he is insecure, and he's a little crazy. So we know that he's having some problems, and he knew when he was lucid that he wasn't the most confident man, so he appointed George Grenville to be the prime minister. This map that you're seeing to the right, this is the colonies, and you're seeing how they've expanded from 1700 all the way to 1763. The tan area is where they've expanded to, but you can also see the Proclamation 1763 lines they're trying to draw to keep it from expanding any further. And to the left of me is King George III, handsome little fellow right here. One of the first things that Grenville did to impose control on the colonies was create the Proclamation of 1763. It stemmed from Pontiac's Rebellion, where it was an attempt by the Indians to stop the colonists from moving out west, and so the result was the proclamation by Grenville to state that no colonies could move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, the Indians were very happy about it, but the colonists just ignored it, and they're like, they make us do all this stuff. We're not going to really listen to them. That's just ridiculous. So we see a lot of white encroachment on these Indian lands that they weren't supposed to move on. After the war, you can see this map showing the new lines after the Peace of Paris. We're looking at what the French control, which is in the brown, and what the British control, which is in the green in North America. And you can see the really strong hold the British have over North America at the time. All right, it's time to look at some of the acts that Grenville proposed and established in the colonies. Number one, the Quartering Act, or the Mutiny Act, as we also know it. It's where they were stationing troops and ships in the colonies, and they were allowing and forcing the colonists to quarter or keep the troops in their homes. Number two, the Sugar Act, which reorganized the duties on sugar and molasses. Duties are the taxes you pay for the importation of goods. They created vice admiralty courts in the colonies, so if anything happened on the seas, which they were worried about with trading and everything, these courts would be led by British citizens that would be coming over to rule them, not even by their own peers. So obviously that'd make them a little bit upset. The Currency Act stopped any type of paper currency in the Americas because the British wanted to have control over that as well. And the Stamp Act taxed all printed documents. That's the one that everyone's really going to get ticked off about. How the colonists respond to this? They were ticked off. They did not want to have to pay these extra taxes because they knew what they were being used for. They understand to have different duties and everything to regulate trade, but this was just to pay off debt that the British couldn't pay for themselves. So yes, they did collect revenue, but they were getting ticked off while they were doing it. Well, some people actually stood up to this and tried to make things happen, which we're going to see in a little bit. People were also pretty anxious because there was a post-war depression. There typically is a depression or a recession of some type after wars. That always happens, so it wasn't that big of a surprise, but that didn't mean people weren't anxious about it. So all of a sudden they had to pay these more taxes. Times are tough already, and now they have to do this. Ticked them off a little bit. Sometimes we do see a little bit here and there of taking the focus off of the British, and that was when the Paxton Boys and Regulator movement were actually upset with their own colonial governments. So that took the eyes off of the British for a while, but that didn't mean it wasn't going back to this. There was major political consequences to the Grenville program, and now we're starting to see the colonists revolt, stand up to the British. Starting to see the colonists revolt a little bit. Here's some effect. The Stamp Act was the one they were the most upset about. Any printed good, they had to pay a direct or internal tax on a stamp, and that just made them very upset. They didn't want to have to do this. So all of a sudden we're seeing colonial antagonism and unification against the British and their policies. We see some states take it into their own hands, like Patrick Henry helped create the Virginia Resolves that basically said any tax that they put on you is considered something against us. We need to only focus on the colonial taxes, and if you agree to their tax, you're an enemy to us. The Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts created this group that was encouraging mob action. They were kind of our first terrorist group that we see, where they actually were attacking not only people who were enforcing the Stamp Act by selling them, but actually lieutenant governors who had to be in charge of it as well, like Thomas Hutchinson's house. And ironically enough, he actually was against the Stamp Act, but he really felt his duty should be England, so he had to support it. But in reality, he really was against it. But Parliament realized that things were getting out of control, so they said, listen, I'm going to get rid of the Stamp Act. You don't have to do it anymore. However, at the same time, I am enforcing the Declaratory Act that says anything we do from now on, you have to obey. So it's hilarious because all of the colonists were like, woo, we got rid of the Stamp Act. Yeah! But they didn't read the rest of it that said, oh, and by the way, anything else we pass from now on, you have to follow and you can't complain about it. So we're going to see a little backlash with that later. Here's a picture of the Sons of Liberty hanging Tories, or people who supported the British government, from a flag post in the middle of a town. So as you can see, they're already getting into the mob action. Grenville's out as prime minister, so now we have the leader Charles Townshend, who is going to take over this program and try to fix things. He basically took over because William Pitt, Lord Chatham, who was the leader of England, was kind of losing it too, so they needed someone who was a little bit more lucid. So he created what was the Mutiny or Quartering Act, and the colonists just refused to do it. He was trying to enforce it, so he basically, in retaliation, suspended New York's assembly until they followed them with Quartering Act. So he used New York as a scapegoat rather than upsetting everybody at one time. He just wanted to use them as a scapegoat and an example. But it still ticked everybody off anyway. All right. So he also had to defend what he called external taxes, which were the new taxes that we were seeing on the Townshend duties, with the new taxes on lead, paint, paper, glass, and tea. It was rolled in to the prices of everything rather than a Stamp Act, which was an internal one directly put on prices. He's like, well, if it's rolled in, they won't mind. They've been paying duties like that for a while, no big deal. But people were ticked off because they said, okay, we've paid those before, but it was to regulate trade, not to pay for your wars that you can't afford. Knock it off. So there were boycotts. They said, fine, if you're going to make us pay this money for all these imports you get bringing in, we'll just make our own stuff and not buy from you. So they started to boycott British products, especially in Massachusetts. Next, we're going to talk about an event during this time that a lot of you have probably heard of before, the Boston Massacre. So here's how it all started. Troops were being sent to Boston to protect the Board of Customs Commissions, and they were getting paid terribly. So the troops were competing for jobs after they got done protecting the commission with other colonial people. So they were getting mad because they had to compete with the British soldiers for jobs, which the marketplace for jobs is already scarce anyway. So on March 9, 1770, when they were standing guard of one of these, of a shipbuilding place, they decided to, colonists, harass British troops. And they were just throwing snowballs at them and heckling them and throwing things. And then finally the British troops started to fire upon the mob. 5 were killed. One of them, who was the first casualty of the American Revolution, was the mulatto sailor, Crispus Attucks. And the result, Sam Adams created the Committee of Correspondence, which was a way to correspond and send the news out to all colonists of everything that was going on all over the area, all over the colonies, so that it would be able to spark resistance throughout the colonies rather than just in one area. Why the heck was it called a massacre? It's just propaganda. 5 people are killed. That's not really a massacre. I'm not saying making light of it, but they used it as propaganda to fire people up. I'm sure you've seen this picture before. This is the drawing of the Boston Massacre, drawn by Patrick Henry. You could see that it just depicts it as, if this is propaganda, it shows the British lined up, they're ready to fire, they look evil, they look bad, while all the colonists look very innocent. It's just, again, to fire people up. In order to make some changes, the colonists looked to the actual English Constitution. It wasn't written, but it was a lot of just documents put together. and they wanted to get ideas from them and Puritan ideology of how to run the show. And the colonists liked England's power distribution, where you should distribute it between the monarch and the aristocrats and the common people, and that would avoid corruption and tyranny. But we weren't seeing that happening. King George was taken over. He was a tyrant, and he was just taking over all the power. So they actually wanted a different type of representation. Colonists felt that they could only be taxed by their consent if they had a spot in Parliament. But they basically, Parliament said, no, we represent everybody. Every single person here represents everybody. We don't just represent an area where we're from. It's everybody we represent. So they rejected that. And the colonists were like, no, you need to have certain people from certain areas representing you, and they thought that was wrong. For a while during the late 1760s, early 1770s, there was some calm, but there was still revolutionary discourse. Like I said, there was calm, but people were still talking about revolution. And then they started getting upset once the Tea Act was passed. Now, there wasn't a new tax on tea. It just basically gave the East India Trading Company full control over all tea sales in the colonies. So they had a monopoly over tea, and that really upset the British. So that's when we saw the Boston Tea Party in March of 1773. Sons of Liberty dressed up like Indians. They were trying to stop the tea from coming into port because they didn't want it being sold, but they still brought it in, and that's when they started yelling, dump the tea into the sea, and raid the ships and threw millions of dollars worth of tea into Boston Harbor. And this is, other people heard about it, and it set off reactions and other mob actions all over the colonies and other cities. So, of course, the British were going to be upset about this. They really didn't want to lose all that tea. As disgusting as tea is, it still cost them a lot of money. So they passed the Coercive Acts, or as the colonists dubbed it, the Intolerable Acts, where they basically used Boston as another scapegoat to tell people, don't mess with us. Number one, they closed the port of Boston. They limited Massachusetts to their self-governing. They were no longer allowed to self-govern. They had to be under martial law, which is the military ruling. They required the quartering of troops, and the royal officials were the ones that were being tried in England. They couldn't actually get tried in the colonies. So the consequences were this. With the Coercive Acts and the Quebec Act, that's the one where it gave freedoms to the Roman Catholics. The colonists felt that England was being tyrannical by doing all of these things, and they unified resistance against them. So guess what? It keeps going back and forth. They do something to us, we do something to them, get ticked off. So we unified, and we made the first Continental Congress, and we did several things with this. First of all, we decided that we weren't going to let them use any of this oppressive legislation against us that they've created since 1763. We were just done with it. We weren't even going to follow it. That's where we were endorsing our grievances. Number two, we approved the Suffolk Resolves, which basically recommended that military be prepared just in case we have to defend ourselves against the British. And they enforced the boycotts. Just don't even buy British goods anymore. The British realized, okay, this is pretty bad. We're starting to have some major issues. It might turn into revolution. They were really nervous about it. So they tried a last-ditch effort to try to make peace with the conciliatory proposition that was trying to rescind the Coercive Acts and lay off a little bit, but it was too little too late. We were already ticked off enough that we were just done with them. All right, let's talk about the first battle of the actual Revolutionary War. No one knew it was an actual battle of the Revolutionary War yet. We're not going to learn that till much further down the road, but let's talk about this. This is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. General Thomas Gage, who worked for the British, he sent troops to Lexington to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, leaders of the Sons of Liberty, and to seize gunpowder in the town of Concord in April of 1775. He felt a little reluctant to do this at first because he felt like he didn't have enough troops, but he eventually sent them in. Well, we knew about it. Our colonists knew about it, so Paul Revere and William Dawes rode their horses to the towns and alerted people about it, and they said, the British are coming, the British are coming. That's where it came from. And they set up their Minutemen, or the militia, to resist it. And at the time when they first got to Lexington, 8 people were killed, but there's more to that story. When the British troops got to Concord to raid the gunpowder supplies, when they got there, they realized that the Minutemen had actually removed most of it, so they destroyed anything that was left. But at the time, they got attacked by Minutemen, and on their way back to Boston, about 170 of them got killed. So the colonial version of events made it look like this huge victory, this great win against the British, and it rallied many people to a patriot cause. But now most colonists are seeing a clear difference between the British and the Americans, and we're going to see the war begin. This is the shot heard round the world. This is what started the Revolutionary War. The English said that the Americans shot first, the Americans said the English shot first, so we really have no account of who fired the first shot. If you look at this map, it shows the movement for the Battle of Lexington and Concord. You can see the dotted line shows William Dawes' bride on April 18th, and you can see in the dark black line what Paul Revere's ride to warn the Americans that the British were coming, the colonists that the British were coming. And then you could see the troops moving, and you could see the two blue lines showing the attack of the British up in Lexington. So how did they get people to actually fight for their cause? Well, here's an example of a recruitment poster that basically said, all the brave, able-bodied men, come join us and fight for General Washington for liberty and independence of our United States. So this is the end of Chapter 4. Next chapter, we're going to see the actual Revolutionary War itself. So this is Thorson, Forge, House.